So my name is Mary Vasquez. I'm a mental health counselor here in Pasco County. I've been practicing here now for 10 plus years. And we're going to be talking a little bit about toxic thoughts this morning. And the reason why I wanted to kind of bring this up, and thank you so much to Dayspring for inviting me to present to you all. The reason why I wanted to bring up toxic thoughts today was because lots of times we tend to question, how does anxiety occur? Now, I don't know if you question that, but I know sometimes I've had clients question that when they come in and they ask me, how is it that they occur? What happens to us when anxiety starts to build up? And believe it or not, our children as well, not that, I know that after COVID, there's a lot of mental health information that is out there that kind of helps us to go over things. But it's also keeping in mind that our children, even from the age of 0 all the way up, that's right, our kids, they also have stressors and anxieties that come up. So the idea of my presentation is what I'm hoping today is that you all will have an idea on not only how to de-stress for yourselves, but how do we help our kids? How do we help our children? How do we help our teenagers kind of overcome what this process looks like? Okay? You all don't have a clicker, huh? Okay. So what are thoughts when we think about them? I'll just do it this way. What are thoughts? When we think about what is measurable in our minds and we think about how things grow, when we think about thoughts, it is what takes up space, right, in our minds. And when we think about what thoughts are, they're very much so things that influence our decisions, our words, our actions, our physical response to things. And sometimes it can become very toxic, not just emotionally, but also very physical as well. So lots of times when we ask what comes first, is it our thoughts or is it our feelings? Our thoughts are always going to come first. The feeling is always what comes after. And why that is, every thought that comes into our mind has an emotion attached to that thought. And if we think about what thoughts are and we think about how that's processed, how many thoughts do you think come through your mind daily? Anybody want to throw out there? How many thoughts do you think actually filter through our minds on a daily basis? And when we think of our children and we think of society and we think of social media and we think about all those things, how many thoughts do you think is actually processed through our minds that we may not even be aware of?
10,000?
10,000? Millions, right? So I don't know the exact number, but it's definitely up there in the thousands to 10,000 thoughts that come in on a daily basis. So it is absolutely impossible for us to capture every single thought that comes through our mind. Absolutely impossible. But what happens is that sometimes when those thoughts come in, there are some thoughts that we should be aware of. There are some thoughts that we should be captivating when they come in. And it's something that we should also be teaching our children how to capture some of those thoughts that come in. So this is kind of this is an actual picture of what our minds look like and what our thoughts look like. So if you take a look at what neurons in our minds look like, they look like trees. They're small trees. And as time goes on, those trees grow. And it depends on what thought process you have that's coming in, what emotion is attached to each of these neurons that is either feeding that thought and it's growing or not feeding. But it's also keeping in mind that this process does not filter what is positive and what is negative. So in our minds, in our thoughts, the way that we've been created, the way that we've been designed is that this process doesn't decipher or separate what is positive and what is negative. So every thought that comes in, whether it's positive and negative, is going through this thought process, and it's up to us or our children to decide what are we feeding ourselves, how are we helping these thoughts to either grow in a positive way or grow in a very negative way? So we kind of got into the information of what comes first, right? So it's keeping in mind that our mind is our control tower. And maybe I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. But then it makes me wonder, why is it that sometimes we have difficulties managing what our emotions are and what our thoughts are? Why is it that sometimes our children are affected by our stressors when we come from work, or our stress when we are interacting with our family system? So this process of really expressing what is within is this psychosomatic surface that comes up. And it's the key to understand that it's to think about more than, the cycles of what we go through when we're processing. And lots of times, life creates certain situations, and our mind is going to react to those situations, right? So I wanted to bring this up because I thought that this was something that was very necessary in discussing, and I don't think we have the conversation enough with our children when we think about thoughts. How many times do you all bring up or even talk to your children or even within your family system of what suicidal thoughts look like? Do you have these conversations? You should. You should. And the reasons why I say that is because lots of times in not thinking about those things, when we bring up suicidal thoughts or we ask the question to our children, it does not mean that they're going to go out now and complete what that looks like. It's the same with adults. As we continue to have the conversation of what suicidal thoughts look like, it is helping us to normalize that when we have these type of thoughts, and our children have it as well, that sometimes in normalizing those conversations is how we're going to be able to captivate and capture sometimes those negative thoughts that are filtered through. So here are just some statistics, and I know that this is in 2021, which obviously COVID probably added on to some of these age groups. But just even taking a look, because our numbers today are not too far from that ages 10 to 24, it is the third leading cause of death for our children. And then if you continue to look at the different ages, and even up to the age of 65 plus, it's the 17th leading cause of death. So what does that tell us? That tells us that lots of times, maybe we're not having the conversation enough with our kids and with our family system of not only what suicidal thoughts look like, how do you identify what that looks like, and how do you help our family system captivate what negative thoughts look like coming in, processing, attacking our systems, but also driving what our emotional state of mind looks like. Does any of those numbers surprise anyone? Anyone surprised? Yes? No? Some? What is surprising to you? Yeah? Sure. Before you decide to end those things. And sometimes I don't think that we realize that sometimes suicidal thoughts can be situational. In other words, whether it's us or whether it's our children, if there's a certain event that happens, sometimes, have you ever heard somebody say, oh, well, I wish I wasn't here? Or if I didn't wake up tomorrow, who would really care? We can't deny that sometimes we're going to hear not only people say that, our family system as well as our children. But it is also paying attention to that sometimes when you hear those comments, those are suicidal thoughts. Now, what does that mean? Suicidal thoughts is not always going to lead to completing what that looks like, right? But the idea is to have those conversations so we are captivating what those thoughts are and having those conversations with our children so we can normalize that in opening the door to allow them to come to us as parents to be able to have those conversations without fear. And that's kind of the idea. is to have those conversations normalized in our household. So how do you address suicidal thoughts? How do you start the conversation, not just in our family system, but with our children and with each other? What are some questions that maybe you could ask if you're thinking that you have a family member that may be showing signs or may not be showing them at all, but may be isolating and not talkative as usual? How would you even address that within our family system? Okay. Okay, so asking them, be direct, right? Are you planning to hurt yourself or harm yourself or others? That's one way. What are some other ways that we can bring up those conversations?
Just asking how they're feeling, how they do.
Definitely.
Kinda.
Yes, it's definitely just asking that question of how are you doing? How are you feeling? How was school today? How was work today? You know, do you have any thoughts? Has something happened? Because lots of times, too, it's that check-in that's really necessary that is going to lead you into those other conversations. Here are just some resources for you, but I'd like to go ahead and move on just for the sake of time. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about perceptions, because lots of times I think that when we think of suicidal thoughts, and these are just my thoughts, that we think that people that are depressed are the ones that show these signs, or people that are severely depressed are the only ones that have these type of thoughts, when that's not necessarily truthful, right? You don't have to be depressed to complete suicide. I'll share a story with you, an experience that I had. I had a young lady, and in my career, this is probably the only case that I ever had that really touched me at the time. And this family system, the young lady was 17 years old, and she was coming through counseling, doing very well, coping very well, came in depressed, and everything seemed to be going fine at home, and the client was she was discharged from services, doing very well. At first she came in, was failing classes, got up to A's and B's, was doing highly well, honor roll, was about to graduate, and a week before graduation she completed suicide. Her parents came home and found her in the home. Now, what led to that? It's hard to say, right? But having those conversations is real. And the parents, of course, never recovered from that. That was a very difficult stage to have your 17-year-old who went through everything that she had to do, coping, the family system, putting her through whatever she needed to do to feel better, to complete those things a week before graduation. So once again, it's real. It's highly important that we have these conversations with our children and with ourselves, okay? So I want to get into a little bit of what perception looks like, because I think sometimes this very much so plays a part of not really understanding or really knowing what's going on. And when we think about perception, I want you all to kind of take a look, and maybe this is something you've seen before, but there are two images in this picture. How many of us have seen this before? Just a couple in the room. Okay. So one picture is a picture of an older lady, and the other picture is a picture of a young woman. So how many of you see the old lady? So a few in the room. How many see the young woman? Okay. How many see both? Okay. So this kind of just lets us know that those that see both, great, but the ones that see the older lady and the ones that see the younger lady very much so tells us that our perceptions are very different. Okay, we're not always going to see the same things that somebody else is seeing, or our children as well. Here's another one for you. So there is a bunny and there's a duck. So how many of us see the duck? How many of us see the bunny? Sort of, kind of. Okay, I see one back there. Our deep processors. And how many see both? Very much so. So once again, perception. So I bring this up because I think lots of times we can get into debates of who is right and who is wrong when we think about perception. So here's a picture once again. Who's to say it's a 9 and who's to say it's a 6 on the floor? But lots of times when we're talking about ourselves or we're stressing with our spouse or our partners or our children, and we get into the debate of who is right and who is wrong. Who's to say seeing the 6 is wrong or seeing the 9 is wrong, right? So the idea with this is to now move from perception into what perspective looks like. So I want to talk a little bit about expectations because perception has a lot to do with what we identify as what we expect. What do you expect from your spouse? What do you expect from your partner? What do you expect from your children? What do you expect on your job? What's expected of you? And lots of times I think we get stuck in these things, not understanding that sometimes expectations is going to lead to what we call cognitive distortions, okay? And with cognitive distortions, it's really understanding that when you get stuck in expectation and you get disappointed because somebody is not meeting what that expectation is, or according to our perception of how I think you should show up, or how I think you should act, or how I think you should feel, then all of a sudden this expectation becomes a measuring tool for disappointment. Are you with me so far? So the reason why I wanted to really get into some of these things as well is because sometimes that cognitive distortion of what that expectation looks like or perceives to be sometimes creates what we call our core beliefs. What our core beliefs look like. And I'm going to show you a little bit of what that could look like. So what I have here is a faulty core belief system. So it is the thought that comes in that is going to lead to whatever your perception is, whatever that feeling state is. It's going to create what our action is going to be or our reaction to certain things. And it's going to create what we call the expectation, our reality. That core belief starts to create what we call the reality base of where we are. And that reality is going to lead us to interact a certain way with our family system. So I'm going to just show you a little bit about what thinking errors can cause and what those distortions can cause. So I don't know if you all can see that, but the all or nothing thinking, that black and white thinking. And I bring this up sometimes because sometimes what we find is, now if I go back to the neurons and I go back to what the trees look like and how that grows in our mind, when we think of all or nothing sometimes, when we have expectations of our children or our spouse or our household or our boss or whatever that is for you, and now that expectation is measured here, and if I don't meet that expectation or that child doesn't meet that expectation or your spouse or whoever that is for you becomes that measuring tool, what happens is that we will tend to disvalue what it took to reach that goal. But in our mind, it's an expectation. So what do I mean by that? I mean that black and white thinking is a thinking error. It's a distorted way of perceiving things. So how many of us can say that we can relate to what black and white thinking looks like? How so for you? Yes. Yes. Does this thing reach here? Okay.
That was very much like in my family, like generationally, parents, grandparents.
So what she's saying is that generationally she can see that it was something that went from grandparents to parents and it was something that you learned as well. Okay. I saw over here Who wants to give an example of what black and white thinking looks like, or how have you experienced that?
I've experienced it as being very set in our way and not willing to flex otherwise. I've made a decision that I think that this is the way something should go, so my expectation is that. I have no wiggle room.
So no wiggle room, okay? Did you all hear what he just said? No? Why don't you say that again, sir? Because that was really good and deep and profound. I like that.
I don't need that.
Okay.
I said it's expectations. You've developed in your mind something that you want specifically, and then you don't allow any wiggle room for adjustment. So you're like, I want the floor waxed in a certain way, and somebody else is like, hey, I can bring this machine in and I can polish it up faster. And you're like, absolutely not. You're still going to do it this way, black or white.
Yes, does that make sense? So then what happens is that the person that wants to come in and wax the floor and does the work, but because we didn't meet it the way that we expected it, being inflexible to that, now we disvalue the work that the person just did. When regardless of it, it's still work, right? The floor is still waxed. It may not be to my expectation, but the work is still there. So what happens is that sometimes we could even do that to ourselves sometimes, okay? We disvalue the work that we do or what we put into it because I didn't meet it in a certain way, or maybe the way that I was taught, or maybe the way I expect my child to perform, and not really valuing their own capabilities and removing what an expectation looks like. Are you with me so far? Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm just going to pull out another one that's disqualifying the positive. I love the one up here. It's up here. Where is it? Where it says, it's not my fault. Could have, would have, should have. Well, there's one that's, I don't know if it's up there, but it's called mind reading. How many of us are mind readers sometimes? I see smiles, so I know that you can definitely relate to that, right? Come on, you assume that I think what my spouse is thinking, or what they're going to say, or what our children are thinking, right? And then all of a sudden we become psychic, we become mind readers, right? And then what happens is that mind reading capability is attached to what that expectation looks like. And then now we're going into what we call assumptions and jumping to conclusions and the could've, would've, should'ves, so on and so forth. Does that make sense? So we have to be really mindful and careful when we talk about expectations and what cognitive distortions look like, because they look like this. Okay? There's one that's called labeling. Okay, labeling. And labeling is kind of going right back to what we talked about before, is that we may label something according to our expectation, and then now all of a sudden everything that was done before that is dumb or stupid. And we have to be careful of that, because lots of times we may trap our own children into believing some of these things, which is going to affect not only their self-esteem, but it's going to attach those trees that we saw in the very beginning and how that continues to grow in ourselves and in our children as well. Make sense so far? Questions or comments about what we're looking at? Yes, ma'am.
So, I guess where it's confusing as a parent, for me anyway, is, I do have expectations of my daughter. You know, I have expectations that she's going to clean a room. I have expectations she's going to help with cooking. I have expectations that she's going to do her homework. So when she doesn't live up to that expectation, me as a parent, I should expect her to be able to do those things. I mean, she's 16. She should be doing those things without me asking. And then if I have to ask her, if I'm telling her you're not doing these things, I don't understand.
Love that. Yes. Yes. So the idea is to start to now introduce what we call goal setting. So now we're setting goals with our children. We're setting a goal with our 16-year-old child, right? We're not expecting, because I'm not saying that there is not a certain way of living that our children should be cleaning their rooms and washing dishes and doing their responsibilities. That's not what I'm saying. Of course, it's part of life. It's life skills that they learn those things and they do those things. But the idea is that, I'll give you an example. You tell a child to clean the kitchen, or you tell your child to come cook, and then now the child is not cleaning the way that you think they should be cleaning, or cooking and making a mess, and then you're not allowing that to happen. That's an expectation. Because now what we're doing is we're disvaluing that there was an effort that came with that. It may not be the way that you would do it, because I don't know about you, but when I had kids, because they're all adults now, but when I had children living in my home and I had teenagers, they're not going to clean the way that I clean. There's just no way. But it is also recognizing that that's okay. You may not clean the room the way that I expected you to, right? But it doesn't mean that just because you made the effort and did it, now that's wrong. Or you didn't do it the way that I told you to do it. So I think sometimes what happens is to be mindful when we do that, because then we start to create in our own children cognitive distortions. Because if I can't please mom, then I'm going to disvalue everything I just did, because it wasn't to her expectation. So now what I'm doing is wrong, so why bother? And then now you get into these power struggles with your teenager, right? Versus let's goal set. How about, by a certain day, whatever that is, Monday through Friday, now you're goal setting with your child. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you clean your room. I know that's a lot. My kids didn't do that maybe once a week, okay? But I'm just giving you an example of that, right? And then the idea, too, is that when you're cooking with your children or you're having those things in your house and they're making a big mess, I know that there are some OCD people in the room and just can't stand the mess or can't stand the way that maybe they do it, but it's also allowing that to happen, because those thoughts that I showed you in the very beginning is going to lead them to grow a cognitive distortion, okay? And that is going to eventually affect self-esteem, affect how they're interacting with other people. They start to create perfectionism. Perfectionism. How many of us are perfect or believe in perfectionism? Definitely not, right? So not there. I know I'm far from that. Okay? But that's what happens with our kids. Now they start to perform a certain way, or our spouses start to perform a certain way, and they think that if I don't do it this way, then it means nothing. So it's really recognizing that we have to build those things in our children and our family system, but doing our best not to create distorted thoughts or distorted thinking errors, because that will eventually start to hinder their interactions with other people and also hinder our interactions with each other. How many of us are married in this room? Okay, so you can definitely relate to some of these as far as jumping to conclusions, assuming our mind readers in the room, okay? Catastrophizing is another huge one, or maybe minimizing things. How many of us have teenagers in the room? Or maybe even smaller children. How many times have your teenagers come home and have really catastrophized a situation? Something so small, but they turn it into something huge, and in our minds we're saying, well, why are you so upset? But not really realizing that that's not only a distorted thought, but then now we have to coach our children to really think about what is going on. Why are you catastrophizing a certain situation? Make sense so far? Any questions about this or comments? Little guy, we're going to give you some time afterwards, okay? Yes, sir. Yeah, that's truthful. That's truthful. There are certain things, and you and I can definitely get into more discussions afterwards, but it's a time to become creative sometimes. Now, is it your grandson that you have? Our great-grandson, okay. Very difficult, very difficult. I can't imagine what that's like. But there are other things that we can do to be very creative. Journaling back and forth with our kids sometimes. Sometimes our children don't necessarily want to talk. Sometimes they don't. But I think sometimes if you take a notebook and you start to write, how was your day, and you put that in the room, and then have this dialogue with your children, eventually they will start to write out what those things are. Now, in the beginning, it's not going to necessarily happen right away, because I think sometimes when they're already at a certain level, they almost start to get set in their ways, but it's also recognizing that their mind is still developing. So our children's minds develop up to into the late 20s. So there's still time for him to change those habits and change those things. It's just being creative with your great-grandson. Okay? Any other comments? So here is kind of what the system looks like. So there is psychosomatic system, there's perceptions. It creates a faulty expectation, which is going to lead to cognitive distortions, which eventually ends in a distorted core belief. So now the question is, what do you do? How do you cope? What are some things that we can start to do that is going to help to kind of get past some of this distorted thinking? So I like to talk about what reacting is and what responding is. I think sometimes we can very much so get stuck in reacting to our kid, right? Or to our partners as well, our spouses. So what does that mean? That means that sometimes you come in and you've had a long day of work and you're stressing and you're trying to cook and start dinner and all these different things are going on, and now your child comes to you and asks you a question and you absolutely lose your mind on your kid. That's happened to me. How many of that has happened to anybody in the audience? For sure, right? You absolutely just lose it. So it is recognizing that, being intentional about what your thinking process is and responding. And I'm going to kind of jump a little bit further down, because I think sometimes I really want to ask this question to you all, is how often do you sit still? Okay, I'm getting some chuckles, right? No way. Oh, there's always a way. How often do you sit still?
Well, I'm 8 months pregnant, so quite a bit.
8 months pregnant, right?
So that's the only time in my life ever, is when I'm pregnant.
Okay.
I can actually sit still because I'm
Okay.
exhausted.
Yeah, exhausted. How often do you pause throughout your day? Do any of you practice any of these things? It's so highly important. And when I hear people say, I don't have time, I'm 8 months pregnant, you probably do sit a lot, but that is a moment for you to start to self-reflect sometimes. And I know pausing sometimes may not be practical, but it's so necessary. The reasons why is because it gives you an opportunity to evaluate. It gives you an opportunity to self-examine ourselves. Where is our stress levels? What negative thoughts are coming in? How are we going to respond now to our children coming home? How often throughout your day at work do you take 5 minutes just to sit and close your eyes and connect to what your core looks like? How often do you do that? Okay. Very, very important. And the reason why is in the beginning of this, I mentioned a little bit about what anxiety looks like. Anxiety is, we all have an underlying foundation of what anxiety looks like. And what happens is sometimes it can be a positive thing. How so? When we're going into an interview or we're going into some place and you tend to get a little nervous, that is something that's very positive. Why? Because you want to perform and you want to do well. But what happens is that as time goes on, when you're stuck in cognitive distortions and that type of negative thinking, you don't give yourself enough time to really capture what your thoughts look like and what is going on. So what I'd like to do today is to go ahead and practice what that's going to look like. So I like yourselves to kind of give yourself some space. Put your purse down, your cell phone down, uncross your legs. This is an opportunity for you to practice what we call mindfulness, right? And if you don't pause throughout your day, this is probably going to be it for you then, okay? So I'd like you to uncross your arms, and I'd like you to just close your eyes, okay? And what I want you to do is to try your best to take yourselves into what we call a safe space. And that safe space is a memory that you may have, a certain place that you enjoy going to, whatever that is for you. And those of you that are practicing it with your eyes closed, if you could just take a second and take your mind into that place. And what I want you to do is go ahead and take a nice deep breath in through your nose, nice deep, out through your mouth. Go ahead and just take your time in picturing what that safe place looks like. Whether it's the beach, a memory that you have from your history or your childhood, a memory that you may have had on vacation, whatever that may be for you. Allow yourself to connect to your core. We're going to take one nice deep breath in through our nose again and out through our mouth. Yes. Okay, when you're ready, you can go ahead and open your eyes. Who would like to share what was that like for you? Who would like to share? Don't all jump at one time. Yes, sir. Where'd you go? Okay. What was that like for you to picture yourself there? It was relaxing. Okay. Thank you for that. Who else? Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
I went to Jamaica on the beach.
Yes, love that. So what is calming for you about the beach?
It's a good question because I actually don't like to go in the beach. I like to look at it and it just brings a calm, like alone, not with my kids, alone. Yeah, I just like to do that. I took that trip alone and it was by the beach and I was able to just relax and free my mind from everything. I wasn't thinking about anything and it was stress-free.
Love that. Love that. So one of the major things that I pick up from that is free. I was absolutely free. But yet, during our hustle and bustle of everyday life, how often do you do that? Yeah, right, it's understandable. But we do have time sometimes just to sit with ourselves and really calm what that state of mind looks like. Because then now this is going to lead you into out of reacting and into responding to our children and our environment and what that looks like. So I encourage you on a daily basis, if you could do it 3 times a week, it's not much, okay? It may seem like a lot, but it's really not. For you to take a second, if you're a person that works at your desk, take a second to sit back and just evaluate and connect yourself to that core. Because then now what you're doing is you are managing your anxiety. You are managing what that emotion looks like. And those trees that we saw in the beginning, now you're actually practicing what that thought process looks like in growing positive thoughts, positive neurons in your mind. Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
Back in 1985, before I pulled up, they had all the office workers take the stress relief course. After 1 hour a day, you stop what you did. Drop the food out, close your eyes, Hold the mask in your hand. And just think about where you're going to be at. And you know when you're totally relaxed because it's nothing falls out of your hand.
Wow.
And they pay you too.
Wow. Where is that? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I was going to say, are they hiring? No. So an hour a day. Amazing that they would even offer that to their employees, which you don't see that today.
You see a simple fact of what's going on. People up in our fire department,
Mm-hmm.
every day you see an ambulance pull up and they're carrying a dead person out of work.
Yes, very important. So I encourage you all to even take the time sometimes and even practice this with your children. When they come from school, if you start to make this part of your routine, then now you're actually managing those different emotions. Now you're actually managing what those cognitive distortions may start to create, and you can kind of get ahead of them so then they're not creating those things moving forward. Okay? So why should we practice this? Why responding instead of reacting? And I'm going to say it's because if you don't heal or you don't teach your children, this is a very simple exercise that you can do on a daily basis. It is really delaying, reaching, and changing any time that you or your children are experiencing cognitive distortions, experiencing thoughts that are negative. If you're not taking the time to practice that, then you're delaying what that looks like, and you may not even know what your children or your teenagers may be experiencing if you don't take the time to ask those things in those moments of quietness, being still, being calm, and just working through what those thoughts may create moving forward. Okay? So what I'd like to do is, if you all have any questions or comments about what we just discussed today. Any questions at all? Okay. Well, I appreciate your time. I thank you so much. Take this back with you. Create wellness in your homes, in your family system, with your kids, with your children. Really understand that cognitive errors, thinking errors, cognitive distortions exist in you and me every day. So it's really important that we tackle these things by really having that discussion with our children, with our spouses, and with our households. I wish you all the best. Many blessings over each and every one of you. Thank you so much for your time.